Fellowship of the Broken, Making Sense of 12-Step Recovery by Angelo. Chapter 4. All in the Mind. The first layer to penetrate in order to approach the source of the addiction problem is to explore the true nature of the apparent reality that we experience on a daily basis. It is perhaps uncomfortable to even consider that our perception of reality may be flawed. The reality of our lives and the world around us seems so very obvious that it may seem pointless to even question it. However, the main enemy of true understanding is our reliance on key assumptions. We tend to use what seems obvious to unwittingly obscure what is actually happening. We take our surface experience to be sacrosanct, thereby overlook and sacrifice the potential for deeper understanding. I invite you to consider the following two statements. 1. All experience takes place in the mind. And 2. There is no experience that takes place outside of the mind. These two simple sentences have profound implications for our perception of life. Before we go any further, we need to verify the truth of these statements for ourselves. In order to do this, we need to understand what is meant by the words experience and mind. Looking first at experience, we can simply say that it comprises thoughts, images, emotions, sensations, and sensory perceptions. Experience is a seamless whole, yet it is useful to break it down into these categories for the purpose of identification. Each category can be further subdivided into yet more elements, but it's important to understand that these are just labels rather than separate things. The following descriptions are not intended to be exhaustive, but hopefully they cover the main elements of experience that we are familiar with. Thoughts include rational and irrational thinking, knowledge, judgment, imagination, memories, projections, worries, internal dialogue, rehearsed or replayed conversations, opinions, beliefs, and sense of identity. Thoughts typically take place in our native language, although there can also be a sense of intuition which is beyond words. Images are similar to thoughts and cover the same range, but take the form of snapshots or videos of the past, present, or future. Emotions obviously cover how we feel and can be broadly categorized into negative and positive. Negative emotions based on fear would include anxiety, terror, resentment, anger, envy, jealousy, loneliness, yearning, lethargy, sadness, grief, depression, and despair. Collectively, these could be described as suffering. Positive emotions, based on love, include contentment, happiness, peace, intimacy, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, harmony, joy, and bliss. And together, these could be labelled as freedom. Sensations cover bodily awareness and include pain, pleasure, energetic vibration, temperature, sickness, and well-being. And perception covers the five senses of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. These are the instruments that register external inputs and convert them into internal experiences. We tend to place a great deal of reliance upon our sensory input, but in fact our senses are relatively limited. Unseen infrared images and high-pitched sounds beyond our hearing are simple examples of how there is clearly more taking place than we are able to sense. There are undoubtedly many more elements of experience, some of which are so subtle that we don't even have words to label them. Yet this relatively simple overview should suffice for our purposes. Turning now to the meaning of the word mind, we find that this has long been the subject of debate and competing definitions. The Oxford English Dictionary defines mind as the faculty of consciousness and thought, a person's intellect or memory, a person's attention or will. Well, this will be adequate for now, although we will explore the nature of mind in more depth in later chapters. Having defined the words, we can now return to our two statements and see if we can confirm their validity, taking each in turn. 1. All experience takes place in the mind. If we close our eyes and pay attention to the elements of experience present in this moment, we will quickly perceive that it is indeed all taking place in the mind. Thoughts and images are obviously in the mind. The sounds and smells seem to be out there, but they are being experienced in here. Likewise, any sensation in the body appears to occur in a particular location, but actually it's perceived in the mind. And the same is true for feelings. Whatever the particular holistic experience may be, it is all unquestionably internal. If we then open our eyes and focus on a particular object, then things seem to be different. The object is over there, whereas I am here, looking at it from here. The assumption, therefore, is that there definitely is an object over there, and this seems so obvious that we take it to be undoubtedly true. However, the seeing of the object takes place in the mind. Light is reflected into the eyes and onto the retina. This then produces tiny electrical pulses that are transmitted via the optic nerve, which the brain then interprets to produce an image. This image is then perceived by the mind. The actual experience of seeing takes place in the mind, yet the object itself still seems to be over there. If we then physically move toward the object and touch it, then this confirms our assumption. However, the experience of physical movement and the experience of touching both take place internally. Spatial awareness itself is a product of the mind. If we take any experience that it's possible to have, then upon contemplation we will come to see that it can only ever take place in the mind. The physical world seems to be out there, but our actual internal experience does not and cannot ever confirm it. All we can be sure of is, firstly, that experience is indeed taking place in the mind, and secondly, that we are aware of it. As we progress through the chapters, we will come to see that our entire experience of life does take place in the mind. Our majority collective assumption is that there is life outside of the mind, but an assumption is not proven to be true simply because the majority believe it to be so, even if the majority is the vast majority. This is a bold but necessary assertion. It's worth spending time reflecting upon this and verifying it for yourself. The conclusion may be unpalatable, but it is, nevertheless, beyond doubt. The next statement is going to be even more challenging, but the logic is the same. 2. There is no experience that takes place outside of the mind. We assume that all manner of events and activities are taking place in the world beyond our immediate personal experience. We know this because others tell us of their experiences, verbally or in writing, or we see news coverage or documentary confirmation. And there's also the powerful influence of collective experience, where multiple people see and experience the same thing. Again, the collective assumption is unshakable, because the evidence seems so overwhelmingly obvious. The first thing to note here is that any second-hand experience that is passed on to us is itself experienced in our mind. Secondly, the second-hand experiencer is only reporting what is taking place in their mind, because that is all that they can possibly experience. And thirdly, we assume that collective experience validates apparent external reality, but we overlook the possibility that there may be a commonality of mind at a deeper level of consciousness that renders this possible. And finally, we project our assumptions about our experiences onto the experiences of others. If we take our version of reality to be sacrosanct, we readily believe that others are experiencing an outside world as we do, which in turn reinforces our belief that there is an outside world. However, we cannot prove that there is an outside world, because our only reliable point of reference is our own experience, which all takes place in the mind. If this is true for us, then it's true for everyone. The whole human materialistic paradigm is based on an assumption that cannot ever be proved experientially. The reality that we believe to be true is not actually real. It's just an experience. It's important for me to say at this stage that our current experience of life is not invalid or unreal from the perspective of the personal mind. The relative world creates an experience that is real from the relative point of view. What I am saying is that there is more happening beneath the surface of the relative world, which we are overlooking or ignoring. Returning to our binary analogy, we can say that an application on a smartphone is real in the sense that it's usable and performs a function at the surface level. But the true reality is that it's built upon layers of complex software that ultimately are created out of and depend entirely upon binary. So we can say on the one hand that the application is real in a relative sense, but we can also say that it is unreal in terms of absolute truth. The application is therefore both real and unreal. And this is a good example of paradox, where apparently contradictory statements are both understood to be true. We will need to become more comfortable with paradox, because it will come up time and time again as we proceed. By understanding this smartphone application analogy, it will hopefully become easier to accept the paradoxical idea that life as we experience it is both real and unreal. The concepts of reality and unreality are simultaneously true, but one is true in a relative sense, whereas the other is true absolutely. Materialism is the prevailing assumption in the relative world. Despite being unprovable by our own actual inner experience, the idea that physical matter exists absolutely is dominant. This certainly seems to make sense based on our relative experience. The materialistic assumption lies at the root of scientific inquiry, and mankind has set out to break down the material world into its component parts and discover how it all fits together and interrelates. We've started at the surface level and are gradually working our way down through the layers. The irony is that the deeper we go with scientific inquiry, the more the conclusions seem to challenge the fundamental assumption of the very materialism on which the science is based. We have produced countless theories in order to try and explain the origins of matter and the evolution of life, but these keep having to be revised and contorted in order to keep up with the increasing mystery of scientific discovery. Most of the science is way beyond our comprehension, hence the materialist assumption continues, despite the ever-increasing evidence to the contrary. And the other assumption that keeps us firmly attached to the relative world is that time is real. Referring back to our earlier contemplation of our inner life, it becomes apparent that all of the components of experience come and go. Admittedly, some elements of experience last longer than others, but it can be seen that thoughts, images, emotions, sensations and perceptions all rise and fall within the mind, and that none of them are permanent. Even if a thought persists throughout the day, it still subsides in deep sleep. No element of experience exists absolutely. All of it is appearing and disappearing from moment to moment. And life is experienced in each moment, from one moment to the next, and this creates an apparent continuity that in turn creates the experience of time. Experience takes place in time, but the mind is aware of any component of experience that arises. The element of mind that is aware of the rising and falling of experience is itself timeless, because time is an experience that the mind is aware of. This introduces our next paradox. Time is both real and unreal. Time is real from the relative point of view, but unreal in absolute terms. I appreciate that introducing such heavy philosophical ideas so early in this book may be optimistic. It's taken me many years of study and meditation to arrive at these conclusions, and my attempts to integrate them into my life are still ongoing. Few of us like to think that we may be mistaken about anything at all, let alone that our entire understanding of life might be unsound. The natural tendency is to defend our existing beliefs and resist or dismiss anything that challenges them. This is understandable, but if we remain closed-minded, then we're going to miss the opportunity for deeper understanding. In this regard, I'm going to return to these core ideas time and time again, using different approaches and metaphors. My use of repetition and summary is necessary in my view. My own experience has been that it takes repeated exposure to new ideas before they begin to penetrate our defensive shields. All we need in order to make a start is the willingness to be open-minded. This requires us to have the humility to accept our brokenness and the admission that perhaps we do not currently know as much about the nature of reality as we think we do. As mentioned earlier, the concept of a deeper reality not only makes sense, but it's also very easy to verify for ourselves. If our metaphorical smartphone application were conscious or self-aware, it would presumably look around at other applications and consider itself to be separate and different. it would perform its functions and believe that it itself was responsible for such activity. Without the ability to contemplate its own existence, the application would overlook or ignore the fact that it was completely dependent upon the multiple layers of software that existed beneath its limited understanding. Likewise, it would never realize that its very existence depended upon binary, or that all of the other apparently separate and different applications were also arising from the same source. Indeed, the application would find it inconceivable that it was nothing but binary, because this would invalidate its own experience of existence. The functionality of the application would simply not have the capacity to understand its own true nature. But as human beings, we do have the ability to contemplate our true nature. We cannot ever fully understand it because we don't have the mind-based capacity to do so. But we can confirm experientially that there is more below the surface of existence than we may have previously believed. For some of us, this realization may come quickly or suddenly, but for most of us it tends to mature over time through repeated contemplation and practice. We owe it to ourselves to use our unique gift of self-contemplation to prove that this is indeed so. My words of explanation will hopefully have some influence, but the real proof can only come from your own experience. The mind with which you are reading or hearing these words is the only tool of experience available to you. There's far more to the mind than we think. We believe that the solutions to our problems are out there, whereas the only place that we can possibly experience a solution is in here. This is really good news, because it means that the solutions are much closer to home than we may have previously believed. Indeed, the solution is right here, in our own minds. It's all in the mind. There's a tendency in the modern world to discount or discard anything that cannot be proved scientifically. Notwithstanding the logical conclusions outlined above, and the potential for personal verification, there is still likely to be a belief that science is the ultimate arbiter of truth. If the scientists cannot prove it, then it cannot be true. This is despite the fact that science itself is based upon the assumption of materialism, which itself cannot be proved scientifically. Having said that, there is still tremendous benefit in scientific inquiry, because it does penetrate the surface layer of apparent reality. This would be analogous to investigating and understanding the complex software that exists beneath the functionality of the smartphone application. Science can therefore tell us a great deal about what is really happening, and hence it can provide deeper understanding. It makes sense, therefore, to now have a look at what modern science is really telling us.